My name is Isabel Alcoff. The date is February 28th, 2024. I'm in Boca Raton, Florida, interviewing Jerry Krause. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for agreeing to do an interview for the USC Shoah Foundation. I would like to know your full name.
My full name is Jerry Alfred Krause.
And your date of birth.
I was born on November 7th, 1933, which is also the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution.
That's how you remember. And where were you born?
I was born in Berlin, Germany.
And your parents' names, please?
My father was George Krause, and my mother was Ruth Krause. Her maiden name was Arndt.
Can you tell me what type of home you lived in, an apartment, a house, and where it was located?
We lived in a workers' area of Berlin, not an extravagant area, but a nice area with good schools, and it was apartment houses. It was a different city in those days. They still had horse-drawn wagons picking up trash and delivering beer and other things. And there were pumps on street corners to provide water for horses. Times have changed.
Maybe a little bit, yes. Describe your apartment. Was it spacious? Did your mom have help at home?
The apartment was in the rear of a building that had one building facing the street and the courtyard, and the rear building just facing the courtyard. We were in the rear building, a third floor walk up, and the apartment had a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. And the living room also doubled as my bedroom.
Now, what was your father's occupation?
My father was working for the post office. Prior to that, in his younger years, he had also worked in a grocery store. He never learned to drive. He never had a driver's license, but he could sure handle a team of horses.
And was your mother working outside the home?
My mother was a legal secretary working in a legal office. And these were jobs that they had for quite a few years, and they made a decent living, and we lived well.
Who was watching little Jerry when they were at work?
My grandmother was living not too far from us during the first year of my life, but then she made the good decision to relocate to the United States.
Okay. And where did you go when Mom and Dad were at work after that?
I honestly can't remember any sitters or anything, but I think there were places that they sent me or took me for daycare. But during my infancy, I really don't know.
Was your family a religious family? Did you light candles on Shabbos?
My mother was religious. My father was religious, but prior to his marriage, he was from a Protestant family. And so at age 31, he made the momentous decision to convert to Judaism. And so he was a little bit more casual about things than my mother was, but my mother adhered to kashrut, except for boiled ham, which somebody had advised her was good for her digestive system. So we were assimilated, totally assimilated.
And during Pesach, did you have matzah all week, or do you remember that things changed at Pesach? Or
We yes, we had matzah for Pesach, and my mother made very good chicken noodle soup. typical
yeah.
typical household. We did not observe the Sabbath because in those days people had to work 6 days a week in Germany. And so my father was working on Saturdays. My mother was home taking care of the things that she didn't have time to take care of during the week. And Sunday was a family day that we spent together.
Okay. You mentioned that your father had converted. Did you have a relationship with his family?
When my father converted, his father was very unpleasantly surprised and decided to disown my father. Since my father was one of 10 siblings, 4 of his siblings did not go along with the grandfather's decision. The rest of them I have no knowledge of. I also have no knowledge of my paternal grandparents because I never met them, and I don't remember them being discussed at home. There was no relationship whatsoever.
Were there any relatives other than your father's family that you had nearby that you had contact with on either side?
On my father's side of the family, there were 3 families that were living in a small village about 60 miles from Berlin, a little village called Falkenberg, which means mountain of falcons. But there weren't any mountains there. It was flat farmland, Brandenburg. So those 3 families, one was farming about 180 acres, no tractors. This was all done with horses and by hand, very much like the Amish are still doing in our days. There was no store in this village. If people needed something that they couldn't provide themselves, they had to either get it from somebody coming through the village with a cart, selling things off a cart, or go to the nearest county seat, which was quite a distance away. So it was a very old-fashioned type of environment. Next to my uncle's and aunt's house was another farmyard where an aunt who was widowed lived with her 2 sons, cousins of mine.
Do you remember their names?
I can't remember their names, no, and I have no record of it. The family that I mentioned initially, where I also stayed, their name was Kilian, August Kilian, and I can't recall my aunt's name. And there were 2 sons. One of their sons was in Russia with the infantry. The other son was working the farm with my uncle. And then on the other side of my uncle's farmyard was the village pub, which was owned by another uncle of mine whose name I also don't recall.
Were there any relatives on your mother's side that you can recall?
On my mother's side of the family, there were a couple of families that I recall. There was an uncle and aunt that were living in an apartment in another part of Berlin, and he was a tailor, and he was making apparel for customers in his house, in his apartment. Their name was Brunneck, and the other family lived in a different part of Berlin again. I also don't recall their names, but it was a husband and wife and a couple of children, cousins of mine, and we played together on Sundays when we got together sometimes. And we had a nice relationship with them. And the rest of my mother's family, which consisted of my paternal grandmother, a brother of hers, an uncle of mine, and an aunt, my mother's sister, younger sister. And they left, well, the uncle left Germany in the early 1920s, lived in France for a while, got deported from France because he was working, which he was not supposed to be doing, and had himself deported to Spain. He was very good with languages. He spoke German, English, French, and Italian fluently. And so he ended up in Barcelona playing a piano in a pub. And at one point he contracted an illness, and his mother told him to come back to Berlin and they'd get him cured, which they did. And then he decided to emigrate to the United States, which was in the mid-1920s. In 1933, he managed to bring my grandmother and his sister, my aunt, to the United States as well. And my parents were doing fine, even though things were unsettled in Germany politically, and decided no, they didn't want to leave.
Can you give me this uncle's name, please?
His name was Kurt Arndt.
Thank you. All right. So you stayed in Berlin. Can you describe your school situation?
I went to school for a grammar school, basic grammar school, for 2 terms. And, well, I tended to be a ringleader of troublemakers. And my father got called into school, and they questioned my father whether he had any objections if I needed corporal punishment if they administered such. And he said, no, that's perfectly fine. Don't let any hits miss. And so every once in a while, this was not an integrated school. It was separate schools for boys and girls. So every once in a while, I got my pants pulled down and my backside swaddled. But then after a couple of years, the rules and regulations for Jews changed, and I could no longer go to school with these other kids.
Approximately what year was that? How old were you?
Well, this would have been around 1937 or 1938. I would have been about 7.5 years old. And so I was basically left on my own during the daytime because my parents were still working. Then my mother lost her job because Jews were not allowed to be involved in the legal position, and she was a legal secretary, so that was the end of her job. But don't ever let a German not be working. They have to be productive. So she ended up doing forced labor in a factory that made parachutes.
How did I know you were very young, but was there an explanation given to you who ordered her not to work and who ordered her to go to this other job?
This would have been Jews were registered with the Jewish Community Association, and so the Gestapo and the civil authorities had all the records they needed. Germans are very thorough when it comes to record keeping. And so they made that decision. And at the same time, my father, who was working for the post office, was called in one time, and they said, "Well, Kraus, you're married to a Jewish woman. Would you consider getting divorced?" And my father said, "No, I have no intention of doing that." He said, "Well, in that case, we have to let you go." So my father, being unemployed, had to register that he was unemployed. And he ended up doing forced labor for an electronic company called Erich Gretz. And they made communication equipment. And so he was doing plumbing work in their factory, which was a high-rise building. And he did that for several years and had gas poisoning a couple of times working on plumbing that carried gas for heating and whatever other purposes. And he was working in that factory during the first couple of years of the war, until the bombing raids came along. The British came and bombed Berlin at night after Dunkirk in France. And so eventually this electronics factory was, or not electronics, but communication factory was bombed out. And so the Germans transferred my father to do forced labor at a fighter base in near Magdeburg, which was probably a couple of 100 miles away west of Berlin. And so that's where he spent the rest of the war years until the end of the war. And
were you in contact with him at all?
At this point, I also got in trouble because I wasn't going to school. I was pretty much on my own, and I was carrying suitcases and packages at the nearest railroad station because I also didn't have any earnings or any ration cards, and everything was rationed. And so that enabled me to get food or food stamps or tobacco or some cigarettes or something I could trade. And so I did that. But I also managed to get in trouble where we used to live. I was walking down the street one day, and there was a youngster coming in the opposite direction. He was a little older than me, probably about a year older or so. And he was in his Hitler Youth uniform. And part of that uniform was a dagger that they had on their belt. And so he sees me coming, and legally I was in trouble because I was not wearing the Star of David, Judenstern. And so he walks up to me and he pulls out his dagger and he starts tickling my throat with his dagger. And he's saying, "You know, you dirty Jew, what we're going to do with you?" And he scared the daylights out of me, you know. I thought he was going to stick my throat. What to do? The guy is bigger. You can't fight him clean. He's armed. He's got a knife. So my knee went into his groin, and he doubled over. He had trouble getting his breath. And while he was doubled over, I just kind of blacked out, and I pounded away at this guy. And when I finally came to my senses, this kid was laying on the sidewalk. His face was a bloody mess. He wasn't moving. And it scared the daylights out of me. I said, "Oh my God, I don't know what happened to this kid. I've got to get away from here." Well, I had to get away from a neighborhood where anybody knew me or I knew anybody. So I decided to go to the railroad station, and they knew me there because I was carrying packages. But I bought a railroad station ticket, which you could get for 10 pennies if you wanted to see somebody off on the railroad platform. And so I bought one of those 10-penny tickets, and I got on a train that went to Königs Wusterhausen, the city where my unknown grandparents lived. And I changed trains there to go to Besko-Storkow, which was the nearest town with a railroad station to my relatives in Falkenberg in the farming village. And I walked about 3 miles to the village of Falkenberg. And I got to my Uncle August. And, you know, he looked at me, and I said, "Here I am." And he says, "What are you doing here by yourself?" And so I told him what happened. And I said, "I can't go back there." And he says, "Well, you can stay with us." And he registered me at the one-room schoolhouse where all the grades were in one room. And basically, as far as everybody else in the village was concerned, I was part of the family, and that was it. And so I went to school there, and I worked on the farm with everybody else. And I spent days during potato harvest in the field, bent over, harvesting potatoes with the rest of the family, and played with the kids in the village, and I led a normal life. Well, after almost a year of this, an SS troop moved into the village. For what reason, I have no idea, but they did. And the officer that was in charge of the unit came into the farmyard of my uncle's, And he looked around and he said, "That's a nice house you have there. Do you mind if I quarter myself with you folks?" And my uncle said, "Well, no, but we don't have a lot of extra room. Do you mind sharing the room with the boy," meaning this boy? And he said, "No, that's fine, no problem." And so I spent one night sleeping in the same room with this SS officer, except I didn't get much sleep. But the next morning I went to my uncle and I said, I think this is not a good idea. And my uncle said, "Why, what's the matter? Did the guy bother you, or was there any problem?" And I said, "No, we had no trouble at all, but I'm afraid if I speak in my sleep or if he sees me with my pants down, we're all going to be in trouble." So my uncle thought about that for a minute or two, and he says, "Well, maybe you're right. Why don't you pack your things together when the guy isn't there?" And he gave me some money, and he says, "Take the railroad and go back to your Uncle Emil and Aunt Martha in Soyton and see if you can stay with them." And that's what I ended up doing. I hiked back to the railroad station and I bought myself a ticket and went back to Soyton and came to my Aunt Martha around the middle of the day and explained to her what had happened. And she says, "Well, you can stay with us. You can stay in Kurt's room." Kurt was my cousin, their son, and he happened to be in Africa with the Africa Corps with Rommel. And so his room was empty up in the attic, and that's where I was staying, and they were keeping me, and I was helping out with the household. I did not go to school there, but I was helping out in the yard and doing the working with the crops and harvesting fruit and such, and trying to stay out of trouble, which I did pretty much. And I was there for close to a year. And then some of the neighbors started asking questions about me as far as my aunt was concerned. And she mentioned it, and they were getting a little bit worried about their curiosity. So I thought, well, why don't I go back to Berlin and let's keep things quiet over here. And so I went back to Berlin, to a different part of the city where I didn't know a soul and they didn't know me. And I found some shelter in some bombed out buildings. And at that time, the British were bombing at night. The Americans would bomb in the daytime. And people's lives were interrupted with these bombing raids, people having to go to air raid shelters. But I was careful about what I said and what I did. I stayed out of sight of people, except when I was hauling wood out of bombed out buildings that I had cut up so people could use it for firewood, for cooking and heating. And I would still carry packages and such at the railroad station. And the other thing I did was I carried water from the street corner pumps to people's apartments in a bucket, 2 buckets, which is something that they needed for cooking and household use, and plumbing and such were pretty much damaged from the air raids. And so that's how I got by.
At this point, if you'll allow me, have you heard anything from your parents during this time? Or did they know where you were?
At the time, my parents were hauled away. They told me that I should stay in touch with a family which lived down the street from where we were living. This happened to be a communist family that the Nazis had overlooked somehow. And they said to be careful, but to stay in touch with them. And we used them as a communication center. They would send postcards from where they were. And I didn't reply, but at least I got messages. I knew they were alive. I'm trying to relate some of the other things. Oh yes, I didn't have any ration cards, and so I couldn't buy any food. So what to do? In the middle of the night, I would get up. People had these little victory gardens behind their houses or behind the apartments, and I would steal a little bit of vegetables or fruit. Not enough to make anything obvious, but just to get some nourishment that I could fix up for myself. And I started to break out with these pussy boils all over my body. And so when I was living in my old neighborhood, I was friends with our doctor's kids. They had a boy and a girl. His name was Yendrosh. And the doctor couldn't see me because that would get him in trouble. But I mentioned to the kids what my problem was with these abscesses. And so they asked their father about it. And he said to get some potassium salt from the drugstore and dissolve it in water and wash the pus with that, which I did, and it made me a little more presentable, but it didn't do anything about the vitamin deficiency. I also used to go into some stores during the midday hour when the store owners would be in their apartment, either behind the store or above the store, having their main meal of the day. And I'd let something slip in my pocket before somebody came into the store to see who rang the doorbell. And when they came, I would ask for something that wasn't available at the time. And they'd say, well, we're sorry, don't have any. And I'd say, okay, Dankeschön. And I'd walk out again. But always just taking small amounts so that it wasn't obvious. And that's how I managed to get through the war years until 1945 came along. And my mother's factory was bombed out in the last couple of weeks of the war. And so...
Did you know about that? Wow.
Yes, I found out from the communist family that I did my laundry at occasionally. And so we got together. And at this time, life was very chaotic in Berlin because between the air raids day and night and the Russian artillery and the Katyusha rockets, uh, it was almost total devastation. The city was being demolished. Uh, there weren't any stores open anymore. It was chaos. The SS was still roaming around, rounding up so-called deserters. These were people that had been put into what they called the Volkssturm, older people too old to serve in the military. So it was a civilian armed force that they used, and they urged them to snipe at Russian artillery or soldiers. And at the same time that all this was happening, the air base that my father was doing forced labor at was being vacated by the pilots and the personnel getting away and trying to become civilians again. And my father, by some stroke of luck, managed to make his way back to Berlin through the Russian lines and the German lines. And so the three of us were back together again.
How did that happen? I mean, how did you find each other? How did you feel when you were reunited?
This communist family was the key.
Oh, wow.
It was just a stroke of good fortune that my parents had the good sense to set that up before they were hauled away.
Do you remember their names?
No, I don't.
When you were reunited, you had been living as an independent kid for quite some time. How did you feel about having mom and dad back in control? And were you feeling a sense of relief or gratitude? Or how did you react to having your parents back in charge?
I was delighted that we had survived so far and continued to survive. I was also out foraging, which I had become pretty good at. And there were people that had broken into a food warehouse, and they were starting to haul things out of this warehouse. So I made tracks to this warehouse to see what was there to be taken out. And I rolled a wooden barrel of butter down the street to where we were staying, which was basically an air raid shelter we were staying in. And so we had a barrel of butter, but nothing to use it on. But we could use some of that butter to barter for other things. And so that's how we managed to get by for a while. And then when the Red Army came into Berlin to finish off the job during the last 4 days, interestingly enough, the first wave of troops that came in were not Russians. They were troops from Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, this stan and the other stan from Central Asia. They were used as the shock troops, and then the next wave that came in were Red Army. But these people that formed the initial shock wave, they'd basically been told, don't worry about civilians. remember what they did in Russia when they invaded Russia. And so they took that to heart. There was a lot of rape going on. Anything from young girls to 80-year-old women. If anybody had a watch, just kiss it goodbye. Watches were in high demand. It was scary because you didn't know from one day to the next if you were going to survive. There were still a few snipers in neighborhoods, and when the Russians found them, they would round up the men in that street, line them up, and mow them down. You know, decaying bodies everywhere in the rivers and the streets. It was an impossible environment to describe.
How long did you live in that bomb shelter?
Well, I lived in several bomb shelters because some of the buildings got too shaky to stay in. I was fortunate enough that nothing collapsed on top of me and I didn't get trapped. But basically, pretty much from the time that the that the Germans had gone into Russia and got bogged down near Stalingrad. So it was between 3 and 4 years. The summers weren't so bad because you know, it was warm and you could get by nicely. But in the winter time, the winters were bitter cold, and there were times when it was a real struggle.
Did your parents talk about their experiences in forced labor?
Yes, they did. My father told me an interesting story. The fighter base that he was stationed on did not have enough fuel for the planes toward the latter part of the war. For these fighter planes, these Messerschmitts, to go up in the air and intercept the bombers. So what they did is they camouflaged the fighter planes and they built wooden dummy planes that they put out in the open so that, you know, the bombers would think that those are the planes. And one night, while a flight of British bombers was passing over, they dropped the bomb on this field. And when they went to defuse the bomb, they discovered that this was a wooden bomb, and on it, painted in white paint, was the letters Holz auf Holz, which translates into wood for wood, which shows something about the sense of humor of the British. Because a lot of those fighters didn't make it back, it was, you know, it was a tough job.
What kind of communication, while you were really living on the streets of Berlin during the war, what kind of communication was available? How did you find out what was going on in the world?
I would use public air raid trenches in public parks. There was one park in particular that I used to hang out in, which was near a railroad switch yard. And one day, while the Americans were coming in for an air raid, I decided I want to get a good view of what's going on. And I climbed a tree so I could see better. And all of a sudden, there were bombs coming down, and there was anti-aircraft going up from an anti-aircraft tower not too far away. And here I am near this railroad switch yard, and the shrapnel is flying around my ears, and it scared the daylights out of me, and I didn't climb down the tree. I hung on the branches and I let go, and I caught branches on the way down to the ground, and I dove into one of these trenches that had concrete and sandbags over it. And there were some Dutch laborers that were in there sheltering from the bombs because the Germans had also forcibly brought Dutch and French and some Eastern European workers back to work in the factories. And they were free to walk around the city, but we weren't because we were supposed to wear a Star of David and not be there anymore.
Did you, as you were wandering and for survival's sake, did you come across other Jews that were also living in what I guess is called an underworld?
No, I studiously avoided anybody that was subject to being picked up, and I avoided anybody that might possibly have seen me before, because the methods that the Gestapo used to question people got pretty rough if they didn't get the answers they wanted. So I guess I had enough common sense to use my head and be careful. I also, toward the end of the war, I also went to a section of the railroad where there was a curve that was sharp enough where the trains had to slow down. And I would go there with a couple of burlap sacks, and in the middle of a coal train, I would jump on one of the coal cars, fill up the sacks, throw them down, and then jump off. And that was like money in the bank or gold. And it was good anthracite coal that gave a lot of heat, so that kept me eating and kept me going.
1945, May 1945, how old were you?
Well, the war was over in early May of 1945, and I had, let's see, my previous birthday was in 1944, so I would have been 11 years old.
Looking back, having had children of your own, how do you react to your own survival?
I think I was 111 years old. I basically had no childhood. It was a fight to stay alive.
Was there anyone in particular who helped you survive?
Interestingly enough, they were Germans that were not sympathetic to the Nazi regime, but it was hard to tell one from the other. We all looked alike. And so you didn't dare take a chance. But yes, there were people that helped. And just like I helped some of those starving Russian prisoners of war with a slice of bread, there were people that helped people out. And like when I was working the railroad station bit, some people were nicer than others. But, they must have figured that I had a problem. How come this kid is out here carrying packages? Is he a gypsy? What is he? And with a name like Gerhard Krause, I mean, I was as kraut looking as anybody else.
And you had no identity papers, of course, being a
No
child.
ID and no ration cards.
Mhm.
If I'd gotten picked up, I would have been in trouble.
Do you know what happened to any of your other family members during the war?
My mother's family, nobody returned. We were not able to find out anything about them. At the time we left Germany, there wasn't as much information available as that was pre-Israel, pre-Yad Vashem. So we don't have any knowledge of them. On my father's side of the family, the ones that I knew, the uncle that had sheltered me, Uncle August, he was driving a team of horses in the wagon to the woods to haul back some wood to the farmhouse. Unfortunately, he ran over a mine, and unfortunately for him, he survived. It literally blew his scalp off his head, and he was never the same, but he survived. The brother that was in the infantry in Russia never came back. The cousin that was in the Africa Corps that was captured by the British at the end of the Africa campaign ended up the rest of the war in a British POW camp, went back to communist East Germany, to his home, his parents. His father had been a mechanic for Mercedes. I have never been back to Germany since I left, but my wife Eva went back for a second generation meeting in Berlin one year, asked me if I'd like to come along, which I refused. And so she had a friend that helped her get in touch with my relatives, my cousin Kurt in Zeuthen. And so she went out there to visit. And he and his wife had a son whom they named after me, whom I've communicated with, but I've never met. But I've been to many countries, but I never had a desire. I felt uncomfortable amongst Germans. We celebrated our honeymoon on the island of Barbados, and we were on a glass-bottom boat. And there happened to be some Germans on the boat sitting near us, and I just had goosebumps. I mean, they might have been good people. I did some work with a German company after we were in business, and I remember one of the owners of this company came to the States and came to have dinner at our house. It happened to be at the same time that the Winter Olympics were in Yugoslavia and in Serbia. And so he was there for the opening ceremony, and they were having a ceremony by a monument that was dedicated to survivors of the Nazi war. And this guy wasn't even born yet, but you could see him crawling into himself. He was so embarrassed. And I said, it's history. We just have to live with it. Unfortunately, it seems that history keeps repeating itself and we never seem to learn. I remember when I was in grammar school in Berlin, uh, the party dictated what books were there, what could be taught, what could be discussed, and what was off limits. Radios had to be registered with the post office because that way they could they could trace people with shortwave radios that were listening to BBC or whatever else they were listening to. The papers were controlled by the Nazi Party. There wasn't any television yet, so radio news was the only news that was available, besides the newsreel and the movies, and that was all party controlled. Dr. Goebbels. It was total limiting of what people were allowed to hear. And so there were a lot of rumors and jokes going around, but you couldn't believe anything you saw in the public news media. It was mostly word of mouth.
Okay, so after your parents came back, and where did you live, the three of you?
Well, after my parents came back and the Russians took over and set up a civil government under the Communist Party, we applied for a place to live and ended up living in a suburb of Berlin on top of a bakery that had an apartment over the bakery. And
were these places controlled by the Russians or the communists, or were they controlled by refugee agencies?
I got ahead of myself a little bit here because what happened was the Americans stopped at the Elbe River, and the British and the French, and they and the Russians negotiated, and Berlin became a divided city into 4 sectors. But there wasn't any wall in those days. You could travel in between sectors freely. There was no restriction on that. And so initially, we couldn't even apply to come to the United States. My parents had tried to come to the U.S. in 1937, 38, 39. My relatives in the United States vouched that we would not become a public burden, but we couldn't get a visa for the United States. There was a quota. We applied to go to Britain. We couldn't get a visa. We tried to go to Palestine, but the British didn't want us going to Palestine. And so there was no place left to go. So that's how we ended up staying in Germany through the war. So then after the Russians established a civil government, we lived under their government for close to a couple of years and applied to find something in the American sector, which we did. Had packed some hand baggage and got on the subway one evening and got out on the American side, and that's how we got out. And then we were there during the time that the Russians closed off Berlin from the rest of Germany, and the U.S. had to fly everything into Berlin, the airlift. So this was toward the end of that period, I believe, when we were leaving Germany. But first we had to be moved to a displaced person camp outside Bremen, a town called Bremerhaven. And so we spent a few weeks there. And then our number came up, and we got onto a U.S. World War II troop ship called the General Ballou, and spent 11 days crossing the Atlantic to New York City.
Where did you depart from?
We departed from Bremen. We made a stop in Cove, Ireland, in the outer harbor because it was too shallow for the ship, and they transferred some things there, and then the ship continued on to New York City.
Tell me something. You didn't have money, obviously, this time. Your parents weren't working. You weren't working, of course. How is this financed, this trip? Do you have any idea?
The trip was compliments of hires. We did have some money. My mother had some jewelry and goods that she could sell, and we bartered stuff. So we weren't totally without things. And then our relatives in the States had sent care packages to us, and there were always cartons of cigarettes and chocolate and what have you, good things that you couldn't buy. And that turned into money, or things that money could buy.
So you arrived in New York?
We arrived in New York on a Friday afternoon. The ship had to stay in the outer harbor until Monday morning in quarantine. And we were watching the traffic on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, wishing we could be there. And on Monday morning, they finally docked the ship, and we were able to get off. And my uncle was waiting for us on the pier, and he took us up to Washington Heights in Manhattan, where he and my grandmother were living. And we saw each other for the first time in all these years. I'd been a year old when she left. And then Hires arranged for us to stay at a hotel on the west side of Manhattan, the mid to uptown area of West Side, until we found a place to live, which took a couple of weeks. And so we found an apartment on Broadway, and it was 140th some odd street, and we lived there for about a year, I would say.
When did you arrive exactly?
Well, we arrived in New York on September 10th, 1945. No, not 1945. What am I saying? It was 1949. September 10th. I think by the time we got off the ship, it was September 11th. What a day. Uh, so,
What about school? What did you do when you arrived?
well, I had to finish school, high school in the United States. So I went to the High School of Commerce in Manhattan. I joined the soccer team and played soccer for the high school team. I worked in restaurants at night, went to school in the daytime. Uh, it took my parents a while to find work, but by doing this part-time work, I was able to help out at home. And then my mother ended up basically working, cleaning apartments for people, cleaning houses. My father ended up doing plumbing work in Lenox Hill Hospital in New York. And when I graduated high school, I found a job at Fleischmann Laboratories a few blocks up the street from from Yankee Stadium at Fleischmann Laboratories. And I was working in their pilot plant on instant coffee and instant tea projects. It was a neat company. I really enjoyed working there. It was also the time that the Korean War had started. The first Kim had invaded South Korea, and Harry Truman said, "Not so fast." And so they instituted a draft in the United States. And being a non-citizen, I could have exempted myself from that, but that wasn't my nature. I was going to City College of New York at nighttime at the time when I was working at Fleischmann Labs. And so I checked with the draft board to see what my status was. And my chances of getting called were pretty good in the early part of the following year. So I said, well, instead of that, if I'm in college, I'm going to City College. Can I finish my semester? And they said, well, there's a very good chance that you can. So I did finish the first semester, and then I volunteered for the draft and joined the United States Army Infantry. Went for basic training to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And when I went for my induction, one of the things they did is they gave IQ tests. And I guess I scored 144. And somebody was really impressed with that. And so I was questioned at one point, would I be interested in going to officer candidate school? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I'd be interested in that. And so they made note of that and came back a few weeks later and they said, "We're sorry, Krause, but you're an alien. We can't let you go to OCS." So I took infantry basic training at Fort Dix in the winter. And when that was over, I was offered a course at the leadership training course for future non-commissioned officers. And I took that at Fort Dix. It was a 4-week course, and I passed that course. And I also took a test as a linguist in German while I was going through all this. And so they administered the linguist test, which was very interesting. They gave me one of Schopenhauer's books, the German philosopher, and they opened to a particular page and they said, "Please transfer this paragraph." And so I read this paragraph, which wasn't a short paragraph, and that whole paragraph was one sentence. So I picked it apart and translated it, and thus passed the linguist test and became a certified linguist in German. And then I was awaiting orders, which came down from God knows where. And my orders were to go to the Far East. I guess they needed a lot of German speakers in the Far East. So I ended up going to Fort Lewis, Washington. Ended up in a troop transport. Stopped in Adak in the Aleutian Islands. Stopped in Yokohama. Stopped in Sasebo, Japan, at the southern tip of Japan, and ended up in a transfer camp in Sasebo. So they were interested in keeping me at 8th Army G2, which was 8th Army Intelligence. But wouldn't you know it, somebody discovered that there was an alien with horns. And no, I couldn't work in G2. So I got orders to go to Korea. And I ended up in a rifle company in the 25th Division, in the 40th Division, the California National Guard Division. And I ended up in that division up on line as a sniper because my marksmanship marks had been very good. And so I was issued a bolt action World War I sniper rifle, Remington 03 sniper rifle. And that's how I spent the war years in the Korean War, which came to an end about 6 weeks later because the truce had been negotiated. And then I spent the rest of the time with the 40th Division at a place called Kumwa Valley on the 28th parallel, at the edge of no man's land. And it was 18 months of living outdoors in Korea. When the 40th Division was rotated back to California, my time was not up yet, so I was transferred to the 25th Division, which was the Hawaiian Tropic Lightning Division. They were in the rear, closer to Seoul, and I ended up in a regimental tank company. And I really didn't know diddly about tanks because my training had been infantry. But the CEO of the company that I was assigned to checked my records, and he said, my company clerk is going to be retiring back to the States in a couple of weeks. Are you interested in taking over his job? And I said, well, I'll give it a try. So sure enough, I became company clerk in this company, which lasted a few weeks. And then the CEO got a call from regimental headquarters one day. You know, your company clerk shouldn't really be in that job. Why not? He's doing a good job. Well, he's an alien. Company the CEO says, what's that got to do with it? Well, you know, he could be exposed to sensitive information. We don't think that's a good idea. You better put him in a different position. Okay, we'll do our best. So the CEO calls me in, and he says, Krause, you're a nuisance, but we may have a solution to the problem. The supply sergeant should be rotating back pretty soon. Do you want to learn his job? And I said, that sounds like a challenge. Sure enough, I'll do it. And so I ended up becoming supply sergeant in a regimental tank company. Quite a learning curve, but I handled the job. And wouldn't you know it, down the road some months, it was time for the 25th Division to go back to Hawaii. So they called me in, and they say, good news, Krause. The division is going to be rotating back. We can take you back to Hawaii if you extend your tour of duty for 6 months. Are you interested? And I said, it sounds wonderful, but I'm kind of anxious to go back to college before I forget everything I learned. I think I'll serve out my sentence and discharge when my tour is up. So that's what happened. The 25th Division got closed out. I did my job and got transferred to the 3rd Division from Fort Benning, Georgia, and became supply sergeant in a regimental tank company, which ended up also going back to the States eventually. But first I had to close that company out. But when my tour was up, I came back to the States and
Back to New York.
Back to New York City. And I had to start looking for work. My parents were living up in the Bronx in a 3rd floor walk up again. I wanted to go back to school, but I didn't want to go back to City College. But since I now had access to the GI Bill, I decided to apply for admission at New York University down in Washington Square, New York. And that's where I went to night school. And then when I went to a place called the Geneva Association, which specialized in placing people in positions in either the food or entertainment industry. And it happened to be a German-oriented outfit. And so I went there and I asked if they knew of any job opening that I might be able to apply for. So they checked their records and they said, you know, there's a company on 9th Avenue that we could get an interview for you. You want to try it out? They're in the chemical business. And I said, okay, I'll go for an interview. I scheduled that. I went for the interview. The fellow that interviewed me was a gentleman by the name of Jerry Schlenker, who also happened to be an ex-Berliner. And he was in charge of production of this company, which was called Fritchie Brothers, Fritchie, Dodge, and Olcott. It was an offshoot of an old company in the flavor fragrance industry, essential oil industry in Leipzig, Germany, which had been sold in World War I and reorganized as Fritchie Brothers and merged with a company called Dodge and Olcott, which was the oldest flavor and fragrance company in the United States. And so I got to work there. And when I got interviewed, Jerry Schlenker advised me that if you don't mind starting at the bottom, you're fine because we can work you through the departments, but I have to start you at the bottom of the heap. And I was grateful for it because Fritchie Brothers, Dodge and Olcott was one of the premier flavor fragrance companies in the world. The people working there were some of the most pioneering people in the industry. There was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ernest Gunter who wrote 6 big volumes titled The Essential Oils. He was a bachelor. He traveled all over the world, visiting producing areas, working with the people where the raw materials were grown and produced, and sending things back to New York to have them analyzed and tested. And this was the Bible of the essential oil industry. The company had product development people that were top-notch in the industry, and their production facilities included a factory in Patchogue, Long Island, and a branch in California, and a branch in Chicago, and another one in Canada, in Montreal. And so I was happy to work in this company through the various production departments, and got called into the personnel manager's office one day. And he said, I've got a couple of openings. Which do you like better, perfumery or flavors? Well, at the time I was majoring in chemistry and minoring in biology. And I thought about this offer. And being a kind of an insecure person based on my childhood, I figured the last thing that happens is people stop eating, drinking, smoking. I think I'll go for the flavors. And so I started as a trainee in one of the flavor research laboratories. And I spent 5 years there, became a certified flavor chemist, working with people in areas that I had no idea that they had any reference to what we were doing, working in enzymology. And we had one chemist in the factory that had a lab in one corner of the factory where he was building a gas chromatograph, building his own gas chromatograph, which was something cutting edge at the moment, that separated volatile materials according to their boiling points, and then analyzing the fractions that came off and figuring out what the substance was composed of. And, you know, we were doing this way before anybody else was doing it. And it was a good working environment. I really enjoyed the people. It was on 9th Avenue overlooking the Hudson River. Unfortunately, the lab wasn't air conditioned, so it got kind of hot in the summertime. And the boss insisted we had to wear white coats. But it was an interesting place to watch the ships coming in and out. I saw the Stockholm limping into port after she had had her collision. And so I worked at this company, and I noticed there were umpteen vice presidents ahead of me in line for jobs for advancement. And I said, gee, this is a great place, but I saw people that had worked at the same thing for 25 years. And, you know, I said, I've got to do better than this. And so I did some scouting around. I was offered a job in Switzerland by a company which was the premier flavor company in the world as far as appearance and quality was concerned, a company called Firmenich, family-owned firm. And I asked myself, do I want to go back to Europe and start in with Jawohl, Herr Doktor, and, you know, the European system of discipline? And I said, let me look some more. And then there was an opening at a company in Lower Manhattan on the waterfront, a company called George Lüders and Company, which was an old firm with a premier reputation that was more in basic raw materials that were used by flavor and fragrance companies. And they wanted to add value-added products which generated more profit. And so they wanted me to come in there and help them do that. And that was an interesting challenge. I liked that. And so I went to work for this company. And I worked with another chemist who had been one of the original 6 founders of the Society of Flavor Chemists in the United States. Nice guy by the name of Alfred Dietrich, and a lab technician and myself. And this job gave me an opportunity not only to work with flavors and train people in working with flavors, but also to interact with salespeople and the marketing people and the export people. And it gave me contact with customers and customers' technical people. And so this was great. This was a whole new world that it had opened up to me. And I loved the people. The boss was a guy that didn't have any children, and the employees were his kids. You know, he was just a wonderful guy to work with, Fritz Lüders. And nothing could have been better. I liked the factory in Patchogue. I asked him one day, would you be amenable to moving the Flavor Labs from the city out to Patchogue? And he said, no, you know, I like to have the labs around here. I like to be on top of what's going on in the company and to see what's happening. It's an interesting area, and I want to be involved in it. I said, okay. So instead of moving to Patchogue, Long Island, I kept looking for a house. I had been working part-time and going to school part-time, and my marriage was going to hell in the breadbasket. I needed the income. My wife was getting frustrated. My late wife was getting frustrated because she wanted somebody that works from 9 to 5. So anyway, I looked for a place to live. We were living in a house on a corner with a store on the street floor. The owner of the place lived on the first floor. We lived on the top floor. It was in East New York in Brooklyn. Nice Jewish neighborhood, Orthodox neighborhood.
Can you give us her name, please?
And that's where we moved to. Now
Can you give me her name, please?
I'm sorry?
Your wife's name.
My late wife's name was Mary. She was Irish Catholic, and when we first started going together, my grandmother and my mother were kind of aggressively trying to proselytize her and get her to convert, which she did. And then sometime down the road, she wasn't really comfortable with that. And over the years, she turned to alcohol, and she was a good mother when she was sober, but the house was a disaster when she went on one of her bends. We went through this for, well, we spent 16 years together, but it was hard. It was hard on the kids. It was hard on both of us. After about 8 years at this company, George Lüders and Company, the owners were getting up in years, and the subject of selling the company came up, and they had an offer to buy the company from Monsanto. And a few of us key employees got enough financial backing to come up and match Monsanto's offer and make a cash offer for the company. But then the money people came into the picture, and they advised that the owners would be better off with the Monsanto stock than with a cash offer. So there went that plan. So I shopped around for greener pastures, and I didn't have enough financial resources to start my own business. So I looked for companies to invest in. And there were three candidate companies that I was looking at, smaller firms that had potential. One was in the Baltimore area. The other one was in Jackson, Michigan. And the third one was in Northville, Michigan. And the company that I made an offer for was the one in Northville, Michigan, because it was in the deepest trouble. The owner's family had been in the soft drink business in Detroit, a company called Cadillac Ginger Ale. The owner wanted to be his own boss, and his father wasn't ready to give up the ship. So he bought this company in Northville called Northville Laboratories, which had been formed in all years in 1929. The guy that bought the company made a go of it, had a good customer list, and most of his business was in pure vanilla extract, a product which is one of the most popular flavors, but it uses between 30 and 40% alcohol. He had a good customer in Massachusetts called, what was that chain that had the stores, the restaurants along the highways? And
Howard Johnson's.
Howard Johnson's. Howard Johnson's was one of his valued customers, and he had many more. But the other thing that had happened is analytical methods had become a lot more sophisticated than they had been in years past. And some of the shenanigans that were going on in the flavor industry were not practical anymore because they could be picked up. And if you were using alcohol, you had to file your formula with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and you got most of the tax that you had to pay back at the end of the month or the end of the quarter. You had to file a bond to make sure that the government was getting that money come what may. You got inspectors coming in periodically to take samples and check your records, production records. And this guy could not operate the business that way, the way it used to be. So I cleaned that up, and I worked diligently diversifying the business. I brought back a couple of salespeople from New York and New Jersey that were quality people, had good contacts. One of the things that we qualified for and got approved for was the flavor for the orange powdered beverage that General Foods was selling, the Tang product. And there was a chance to get that business, but we didn't get it because the owner got greedy and wanted 50 cents more than the company was paying at the time, so that went away. But anyway, I spent 16 years building this company with other people I hired and the other owner, from $300,000 a year to $7 million a year. Built it from a regional company to a national company with a branch in California and doing business nationally and worldwide, developing an export market, and doing really well. And my majority partner took a lesson from the movie The Godfather. During Prohibition, when he was working with his family, he had served the blind pigs and the speakeasies in the Detroit area. He had joined the Teamsters Union and became involved with the Teamsters. He knew the good guys and the bad guys. And he started holding up a couple of my major customers for more money because there was a vanilla bean shortage. My process of doing business was to negotiate yearly contracts with major customers for what they needed and guarantee availability and price. I had contracted a 1-year contract with Durkee Foods for 40 tank truckloads of pure vanilla extract worth about $3 million. I also had all the pure vanilla business at Safeway supermarkets, at Kitchens of Sara Lee, and several other customers. And I said to myself, I can't work with this guy. It's going to kill my reputation. And my reputation was the most important thing to me because I'd worked my whole life for it. And so I offered to buy him out. Well, how do you set a value on a closely held company? It's really hard. I said, no, it's not hard. You just have to make up your mind you want to do it. Well, I'm not ready for it. So how about buying me out? That went nowhere. So I talked to a firm of attorneys in our area. One of their partners actually also handled the legal business for the Vought in Detroit. And we discussed the situation, and the attorney that was handling our deal said, well, why don't we sue for dissolution of the company? I said, if you think that's going to work, let's try it. So we did. And shortly before this thing ultimately went to trial, my majority partner offered to buy us out, offered about 15 cents on the dollar. And we said, let's get out of this mess. And we did. And everybody said, watch this guy, he's going to sue you. But we watched our Q's and P's. I worked with a company in Germany, in Stuttgart, that wanted to develop some customer base in the United States. And so I spent about half a year working with them. And then we ultimately decided, okay, we're gonna form a separate business, and we started a firm called Kraus and Company, and registered and started from scratch, leased some property. I had bought some equipment at a couple of auctions, and it takes a while to get customers to change their source in our business, because flavor is the thing that people complain about first if something changes. It doesn't taste the same or it doesn't look the same. So, anyway, we went for about a year and a half without a paycheck. I worked with some friends in Mississauga, Ontario, that were doing a lot of business selling syrupy, sweet type of preparations using a lot of sugar. And they were shipping trailer loads of edible dessert mixture, which was exempt from duty. They were shipping this edible dessert mixture to Kraus and Company, which had bought a 48-inch screen, and this mixture was exempt from duty because it contained less than 35% of sugar, and the rest was rice. But it was a type of rice with rounded kind of edges, so we could run it through the screen and separate the sugar. And one of the wholesale bakery companies took all the sugar we could bag for them for a nickel less than the market price. And there were a couple of other companies doing this also. And between us, we were doing about 5% of the sugar business in the United States. And then, lo and behold, one day, the baking company had asked me to consider putting in a bulk terminal so I could ship the sugar in bulk trucks. I said, well, if you folks want to arrange the financing, I'll put the facilities in. Well, no, we don't want to get into that. I said, okay, and it's going to be bags. Well, from one day to the next, the regulations changed and the government cut the stuff off. So, fortunately, by that time, we had built up some business, so we were getting by, and now we spent 100% of our time on doing what we should have been doing and grew the business. And
How long was Kraus and Company in business, or is it still?
we started Kraus and Company in the 1970s in, let's see, no, it was 1960s, at the end of the 1960s. And we sold it I think probably about eight years ago to a company on the West Coast called Carmi Flavors. The founders of the company was also a survivor from Poland, a gentleman called Frank Carmi. We became good friends over the years. Frank Carmi saw the Germans coming into Poland, packed up, and went to Russia. Ended up an officer in the Russian artillery. Spent the war with the Russian army in the artillery, and by hook and by crook made his way to Turkey and then to Palestine. Met a lady over there that was related to a family in New York City that had a flavor and fragrance company called Fluorescent. Very successful, established company. One of their good customers was a fellow by the name of Charlie Refson, who owned Revlon. And Frank Carmi met this lady. They hit it off. They were the right chemistry and got married and lived in Israel. She gave birth to a son who had a heart defect that they were trying to treat in Israel, which was Palestine at the time. And they said, you know, if you want to get this taken care of, right, you should really take him to the U.S. So they got their Fluorescent part of the family to run interference for him. They came to the United States. Their son, Elliot, was eventually treated and cured. And Frank Carmi went to work for Fluorescent and learned the business. And then after a few years decided to strike out on his own. I guess he'd made contacts and he started his own company. And we stayed in touch, and we had meetings of the Society of Flavor Chemists in New York regularly. We were members. And we saw each other at conventions and had a good relationship. So when we were selling the business, it was to Elliot Carmi. His father had passed away already, and Elliot was running the company. And I thought seriously to myself, because at one point earlier in his life, Elliot Carmi had sued his father. And that's not the way you run a family business. But I thought maybe he had matured over the years. So anyway, we sold the company to him. We had a contract for 2 years to work during the transition, which we did. And then we formed a consulting company called what the heck were we called? Krausko Flavors and Fragrances. And we didn't do any manufacturing anymore, but we sourced out some manufacturing to companies that the customers that we were hoping to supply were comfortable with, and helped them make products that they could buy, and we could collect the royalty on those companies. And so we had an income stream coming in. And that was basically the history of our lives. Here we are, retired.
Actually, you talked about your business. Now I'd like to hear about your personal life. Who you married, had your children.
When I was working at Northville Laboratories, uh, we had a lady apply for a job opening that had moved to Detroit or to Oak Park, Michigan from New York City, that had worked for International Flavors and Fragrances. And I interviewed her, and it was in the early part of our business at Northville, and things were still pretty tight. And I said, I'd love to give you a job, but I can't put you in the lab right away. I'd have to put you in production for a while. And this is what we can pay. And she had a son. She was separated. And she couldn't live with that. So I said, well, do you mind if I get back in touch with you if things loosen up over here? No, that's fine. And so she started learning, becoming a dental technician. And we worked at growing our business, and things got better. And we contacted her. She came in for a meeting, and we agreed to hire her in the flavor lab with the purpose of learning flavors instead of fragrances, because our fragrance customers were mostly technical kind of customers, pretty basic stuff. And we needed help in the flavor area, and she came to work for us. And then over time, I got her into attending a couple of conventions. We got to know each other a little better because my mother was living in New York City, and she had family in New York, and so we'd drive together and then split up when we got to New York, and then drive back together and save on the cost. And, and then eventually we got to know each other a little better. My marriage had gone from bad to worse, and we'd agreed to separate. My former wife was attending AA meeting and on the wagon, but she basically didn't want to get back together, and I'd gotten tired of living in a trailer. It just wasn't working out, and so we finally decided to divorce. And Eva decided to divorce because her husband had abandoned her son and her, which is something else that we shared because my maternal grandfather had abandoned his family also when the kids were teenagers. So it kind of ran in the family.
And her name was Eva. What was the last name? Eva's last name when you met her?
Eva's last name when I met her was Klein. And so she didn't even have to change initials.
Okay. Well, fast forward a little bit. It's 2024 now. There's a lot of world events that are affecting survivors particularly. Can you tell me how you're reacting to the current world situation?
Yes. When I first left Germany, I thought very seriously about where do I want to go from here. And I kind of thought about Canada because it was a younger country with a lot of opportunities. But being 13 years old or 14 years old, you go where your parents tell you to go, and that's what I did. Later on in life, living in the States, I like the political system. I had a problem with the divisiveness that developed in the company and the country, and I was disappointed with the job that the educational system was doing with young people. And as you can tell from my shirt, I was thinking about that same question again. If the world goes to hell in a breadbasket, where's a good place left to go? And I thought to myself, the best place is probably some insignificant place that's got nothing that anybody is hungering for. And I searched the map and I settled on New Zealand. And so one year we took a nice trip to Fiji and Australia and New Zealand, and we spent 6 months. And we liked it all. And I liked the people. I liked the agriculture. I figured if worst comes to worst, that's not a bad place to live. And here we are. We still have the same problems. I'm sorry to say that I see the same things starting to happen here that happened in Germany in the 1930s. And I would hate to see that happen to this country. The lack of tolerance is unacceptable. But I'm at an age at this point where every day is a gift. When the morning comes, I say thank you. And if that's the last day, so be it. But I think I'm past the point where I'm ready to pack up and move away.
Is there anything that you wanted to say, had on your mind, that we have missed today?
I raised 7 children, and I'm blessed with a few grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And my oldest son and my oldest daughter are no longer with us, I'm sorry to say. But the rest of them are all successful in their lives, doing a nice job, living their lives and raising their kids. And that's a mitzvah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
After having run my mouth all this time, I'd like to introduce my dear wife and partner for many, many years, getting very close to 50 years, Eva Kraus.
Eva, what would you like to say today?
About Jerry
Yes.
or
About Jerry and what you know about him and his family.
well, when we got married, he brought in 5 wonderful children, and then took one of mine. And as much as he wasn't too keen on having one more, I think it was the best thing he ever did, is have that one
I
war.
agree.
And it's been up and down, but mostly up. He's a great, considerate person. And he was loved by everybody. My parents loved him. My sister, my brother think very highly. And the kids all adore him. That's the main thing, right? And I love him too.
Well,
How has the Holocaust impacted your relationship?
Well, being that both my parents were Holocaust survivors, I went through with them. And even though he says that he never has nightmares, but that's only in his head. He does sometimes have nightmares.
how did your father react to your marrying me?
Once he met you, he was okay with me marrying you. It's when I went out with you that he walked out of the room when you came to pick me up. Because it was like, I had one child and he had 5. And my father did not believe that he could love David the way he loves him. And but I think after about the 3rd, 4th time he met him, and let's see, after we got married, they said, if you ever get divorced, just leave. We're gonna keep him.
Well, I made skiers out of all but one of my children, our children. The reason that one of them did not become a skier, he was born with a mild case of cerebral palsy, and he towed in. And if you tow in with skis, you're in trouble. But they all became skiers. We spent a lot of time playing tennis together. We spent a lot of good hours together. Did some traveling, saw things, did things. Got seasick. I've never been seasick, but they did.
And I did. I did. The worst. The captain said I never took anybody back, but I'm not going another minute with her. It took me back.
You know the feeling.
So, yeah.
Anything else you would like to add today? We're very proud of Jerry's testimony today.
Well, I think I'm very proud of him, and I'm very happy.
I'm glad.
He is number 1 in our family.
Thank you. Thank you both.
All right, this is the picture of George Krause and Ruth Krause, my parents, at their wedding. And I think those are Lily of the Valleys that she's got. She was very fond of Lily of the Valleys.
Do you know approximately what year that was?
Probably 1932. That is a picture of my grandmother. Eva, will you take a look here? Is that Rena, or that's Rena? Okay, that's my aunt, my mother's sister. Rena, her family name is Travis. She married an Irishman. That's one thing her and I have in common. We like the Irish.
And what happened to her during the Holocaust?
She left at the same time my grandmother did in 1933 or 1934. That is a picture of Ruth Krause, my mother, at the time that she was a legal secretary, and most likely it was pre-marriage. And that is the Krause family. Before there was any war or anything, I looked like I might be either 3 or 4 years old. I had the sailor suit, and I'm told I was a good-looking kid. And my parents look in good health too and look happy being there. That is a picture of Jerry Krause getting ready for soccer season. That is the combined Klein family and invaders from the Krause part of the family. And the good-looking kid on the left side looking at the picture is David. And then the girl in front of him is Shoshana. And Eva's brother on the right-hand side with the red hair is Joseph. And his brother-in-law next to him in the back, Chuck Donnelly, who is Eva's sister's husband. He is a veteran of Vietnam, the Coast Guard. And Eva's dad is in the middle in the back, and her mother is between Eva and her dad. And her twin sister is to the right of Eva's dad. Those were the days, my friends. We thought they'd never end. We were at a luau in Hawaii having the time of our lives, and wish I was there again.
Maybe.
A young man that interviewed me for a school project put this montage together, and there I am in basic training in my uniform, and on the right-hand bottom side, there I am just outside the demilitarized zone in Korea. And of course, the upper right-hand corner is myself. And in the upper left-hand side is my mother and me, I think. I guess so. It's kind of a pale picture, but oh yes, and my father. It's the group picture.
Who made this for you? Who made this picture for you?
A young man that interviewed me for a school project. That is the Krause seniors with Shoshana Krause and her daughter Shira with the red hair. And in the middle we have Maya, and to the left we have Emmy. Maya and Emmy are twins. And missing is her husband, Eric, who was probably at work when the picture was taken. His name is Johansson. Christensen.
Good try.
Gosh, I did. There is one of the great pleasures in my life. I once wanted to become a round-the-world sailor, but I worked too much. And that's my oldest son, Richard, running the boat, and I'm sitting on the deck house there behind the sail. And we are doing the Lake Huron double-handed challenge sail, which is a 150-mile race on Lake Huron that we finished with the Undertaker's Prize called Dead Last.
Bravo, Jerry.
And there's a picture of the Ganzimmersbacher We are celebrating my 90th birthday up in Michigan with the whole family that was available, and friends and neighbors and children. And it was a grand old party. And who knows, maybe there's going to be one in another 9 years.
Exactly. Amen.
Who knows? And there are a bunch of Krauses and then some with hair on their chins. And thank goodness Shoshana doesn't have hair on her chin. You know,